Hello everyone. Welcome to this React tutorial. In this video we will create a simple full-stack web application using React with JSX as the front end, a Node.js server as the back end, and a Postgres database. When I say this is a simple application, I mean we're going to use as few package installs as possible and no IDE like VS Code. This means no React framework, and we will use the operating system file explorer, notepad++, and PowerShell terminal instead of an IDE. Now, why would I do this? The reason is because of my own experience following other full-stack React tutorials. In the end, you get a working application, but I find the fundamentals are lost in the process. And are all those packages really necessary? I like to understand how things work. I appreciate simplicity and efficiency. What we're building with this tutorial is not a production-ready, industrial-strength application. It is meant to show how to create a full-stack web application and touch on basic concepts of React components, a little bit of styling, a build process, basic server request handling, and querying data from a database. So let's dig in. First, we'll need a project folder. Let's call it the ABCs. Inside that folder, we'll create a folder for the client application. That folder will contain a folder called dist. This folder will contain all the files that we need to be deployed to the server. This will also be the output folder for the build command. We need another folder called JSX. That will store our React component files. Next, in the dist folder, we will add a folder for images. Now let's go back up to the main project folder and add a new folder for the server project. Inside that folder, create another folder called static. The files from the client project dist folder will be copied to this static folder in the server project. This will be the deployment process. Now let's go back to the client project folder and right-click Open Terminal. From here, we will install our React Node packages. Type npm install react react-dom. Notice the package.json file and the node modules folder has been added. If we take a peek at the package.json file, you see there are two dependencies. Let me move this a little bit. React and React-DOM. This file is automatically generated by the install. And if we look at the node modules folder, we have 3 folders as a result of that install. Now let's go to the dist folder, create a new text file, and call it index.html, and open it in the text editor. This will be the default web page that the server returns as the home page by default. First thing is doc type HTML. That's the first line of your HTML document. Then we do the begin tag and end tag for the HTML content. Inside there, we'll have a head and a body. Inside the head, we will start with a few meta tags. One for char set. This will be UTF-8. One more meta tag. This is for viewport, and this makes it more mobile friendly, or friendlier for different screen sizes. Initial scale 1.0. Let's give it a title. begin tag, end tag, the ABCs, full stack app. Next, we'll add our reference to style sheet. And we're going to put that in our same folder as the index.html file. All right, inside the body, we're going to add a div. We're going to give it an ID of root. And all of our HTML will go inside this div called root. It gets dynamically added by React. And our next line is the script. Call it bundle.js. And that should do it for our HTML file. Now let's go into the JSX folder and create our first React component. So this will be the index.jsx file. Open it in the editor. Import React from React. We will do that for all of our React components. This one is special. It is the index.jsx file. We're going to include the create root method from React DOM, as we will create the root. I'm going to import ABC header from ABC header. We haven't created this yet, but we'll do that next. Const root equal create root document dot get element by ID root. And this refers to the div element we created in the HTML file with the ID root. Root.render. And in here we're going to type some HTML tags. This is JSX. The ability to type HTML tags within your JavaScript return statement. You're going to see this all over the place in our React components. So we'll have our ABC header. So next, let's create our ABC header.jsx file. Open it in the editor. Import React from React. Function ABC header. And in here we will return some HTML. This will be a header. End tag for header. We will create a div. And two more divs. There we go. Inside the first div, we will add a logo. So this will display on the left side of the header. And I've got a few images. One of them is a logo that I created, and we'll get a look at that in a minute. You can create your own logo. The middle will have a title, so this will be an H1. and we'll call it the ABCs. And the one on the right, or the third one, will appear on the right. This will be our user icon. And again, I created these pictures just using a simple drawing program, nothing special. Now we're going to add a class name. So this is going to apply some styling that we will create here in a minute. App header. And we have one more line of code. For all of our React components, we will be using this last line of code, export default, and use the React element name or component name, ABC header. Everything looks good. Save that. Now in the dist folder, we need to put our images that we created there in the ABC header JSX file. And my user logo looks like this. And my application logo looks like this. And both are in the images folder inside the dist folder. Now we're going to create the styles. Styles.css, open an editor. I'm going to apply a default color for the text so that we don't get just plain black. This is going to be a dark gray or a charcoal color, just a little easier on the eyes. And we need to define the app header styles that we added to the ABC header component. Display flex. Justify content space between. Align items center. And we'll put a border along the bottom, 1 pixel. Solid line. And I'll give it the same color for our default text. All right, now we're going to try our first build. In the command line, it's npx esbuild, and we have a few parameters to add. We're going to build the .jsx index.jsx file, and this will build in turn all of its dependencies. So everything we refer to, it will all get pulled in. We're using the bundle option, and our output will go in the dist folder, and it will be called bundle.js. And it's building. Okay, that was fast. Not much to build, really. And the bundle.js file you see there was just created. And this is the JS file we refer to in our index.html file. And that's the style file we also have in the same folder, sitting right next to the HTML file. And I see the images, but it doesn't look right. It's supposed to be a header. Something's not right. Everything is stacked vertically, but it should be horizontal. So what did we do? I'm going to inspect the HTML. This opens up the developer tools to the right side. Looking at the elements, I can see the style is applied to the div, the first div inside the header. That's not right. It needs to go on the header itself. And then all the children receive the correct styles. And I can't just refresh, I have to rebuild. And refresh, and there it is. There's the header. That's what it's supposed to look like. Okay, next step. Let's create a new component, nav and main pane.jsx, and open in the editor. Import React from React. Import left side nav, which we haven't created yet. This component is going to be a parent component that contains a left-hand navigation component and is a letter page, which is going to be our full screen display for content. We will have a function with the name of our component, and it will return some HTML elements. This is a div. And we're going to have this one styled as well. We want to make sure that our two child elements are displayed side by side instead of stacked vertically. Giving it the class name container, and inside of this main div, we will have a left side nav and a letter page. Those are the two child elements. And as always, we export default component name. Now let's define the styles. That was a container, was the name we used. This will be display flex, align items, flex start, width 100%. Now, if you're not familiar with the terms that we're using here, these keywords, do some reading on CSS, cascading style sheets. We'll do a little bit of styling here, but it won't be much. Now we need to create components for these two items, left side nav and letter page. We will start with left side nav.jsx and open in editor. Import React from React. Function left side nav, and return some HTML. Inside the nav we'll have a div. We'll have an unordered list. Give that a class name, navList, which we will define later. And our list, and inside our list we need list items. And each list item will be styled. class name nav item. So these are our navigation items. Each one will be clickable, so we need an anchor, which is the A tag in HTML. And that will be styled as a nav link. And we'll add a span inside there. Introduction. End list item. Let's do another list item. A is for. All right, let's create our letter page. And one more thing here, of course, we have to export default left side nav. Now let's create that letter page. JSX. Open an editor. Import React from React. Function letter page. Return div. We'll give it a class name. End div. Inside the div, will be a title. And an image. We'll have to add this to our images folder, apple.png, and a paragraph. A is for apple. Whoops. And export letter page, export default letter page. Save that. And go to the styles. Okay, we have a number of styles to define. Letter page is one. Display flex, flex direction. Column, we actually want to display these vertically instead of side by side like some of our other styles. Align items center. Width 100%. Now let's style the nav list. List style will be none. The default are those bullet points. We don't want to show bullet points. Nav link. We'll give text decoration none. We don't want to show that ugly default blue underline. Display flex. Align items center. Gap 12 pixels. Padding 10 pixels. Now I'm not just coming up with these off the top of my head. I played around with these a little bit. We'll give it a border with radius of 8 pixels. And a nice transition effect, 0.2 seconds ease. Next one is the nav link, hover. So we'll have a style for our navigation items if the mouse hovers over, so you'll see that it changes. Background color. We'll do this one, F3, F4, F6. Color, which is the text color. And again, I picked these colors beforehand. And one more, nav link active, for when the user has clicked a nav link, it should be clear that it is the currently selected nav item. Background color will change to this. Text color will be this, 4F, 46, E5. And we'll do a heavier, kind of a bold font weight of 600. Okay, I think that's it for styles for the moment. We need our apple. There it is. Yes, I drew that myself. And build. Okay, and let's refresh. And nothing changed. Let's see. What did I forget? Okay. All I have in my index JSX is a header. I need my nav and main pane component. Let's build again and refresh. Okay, what did I do? Try it again. And now I have an error. Not defined because I didn't import it. Let's rebuild, refresh. There it is. So there's my header, there's our navigation, and this is our main display. A is for Apple. Looking good. Okay, next we need to go into the server project and create our server. So create a file called the abcs-nodejs-server.js. Open in the editor. We will import HTTP from HTTP. Import FS from FS. This is for file system. Import path from path. Import file URL to path function from URL. Notice we don't do any React. This is not the front end. This is the back end. This is the server. So we're doing HTTP and file path type stuff. So this next couple of lines are going to help us manipulate and process file names and paths to the files on the server. File name, semicolon, const port. Let's define our port number. We'll go with a capital port, 8080. Let's declare our server. Equals HTTP create server. This will be an asynchronous function as one of the arguments that are passed in. with an arrow function. Now, if you're not familiar with arrow functions, you should read up on that. So we are defining a function inside of a function call. So the function, this asynchronous function, is one of the parameters that we're passing in. Very common in JavaScript. So we're going to start with a static file handling section where if the browser is requesting a file that we have, we will return it. So we will use this to deliver our index.html file, and the index.html file will be referring to bundle.js and the styles. But here we are processing the file path that was provided by the request that we are handling. So you see the word static in there. That's going to look inside of our static folder. And if they didn't provide a file name, we default to index.html. Now we're looking for the extension name that we are going to use to identify the MIME type. Again, if you don't know what a MIME type is, take a minute and look it up. So if the extension is HTML, the MIME type is a text/HTML. If the extension is JS, the MIME type is text/JavaScript. And we need to support all of the different extensions that we are going to be delivering on this server. So the files we just created, we had an HTML file, we have a bundle.js file, we have a styles.css file, we have a couple of images, which are PNG. These are all file types that our server is going to have to serve up. Const content type equal MIME types ext name, or we have a default value of application/octet stream. fs read file. With this line, we are going to attempt to read the document that was provided to us or requested in this request. Again, we are passing in a function as an arrow function. In this case, it is a callback function, so that when the file reading is done, this bit of code will get executed. First, we'll handle the error case. If error, write head 404. This is our HTTP response method, or response code. res.end, file not found. Else, we have a successful file read. res.writeHead 200, which is a good response in the HTTP world. Our content type is content type that was assigned above. This is our MIME type. Res end content UTF-8. The rec and res parameters are the request and response. So we receive the request and we build the response. And finally, server.listen, provide the port, and a callback function that tells us when it's complete. We will print this message to the console. And in this case, we'll use backticks because we're referring to a variable inside the string. That's not a single quote, it's a backtick. Okay, that is our server code. So let's open up the client application. We are going to deploy our static files from the dist folder to the static folder in the server. So we just deployed our front end to the server static folder to be delivered by the server when a request is made to the server. Now let's open up a terminal inside the ABC's server folder, and we are going to launch our server. To do this, we type node and then the name of the JavaScript file we want to execute. The ABC's Node.js server. And we have a problem. There's a comma there that doesn't belong. Right after res, parenthesis. That shouldn't be there. Save it. Try again. And we are up and running. So let's hit the server and see what happens. To do that, we go to the browser, we type localhost colon 8080, and we have another problem. File path not defined. Let's see. That's an uppercase P. Yeah, it needs to be lowercase. Let's change that one to uppercase. There it is. So the entire website is now functioning and being delivered by our server. Whereas before we were just opening the HTML file in the browser. Now we're making a request to the server and it is delivering our front end. There's our index.html. Now, we're going to add some temporary JSON data. So when we're done, our data will be in a database, but we're not there yet. So we're going to kind of fake our data for the time being. So this will represent our navigation list, as well as when I click on one of the navigation items, what will I see on my right side? So we have a page ID 1, name, introduction, page image location, page image lock, for short. We'll give it the value of the location of our image, and the page text, this is the intro. So this is one data record. So we'll make another one. Just copy and paste. Let's get ourselves aligned. Page ID will be 2. This will be A is 4. The image will be our apple. And here we will state A is for apple. Okay, let's do another one. What comes after A? It's going to be B. B is for boat. C is for cat, of course. Change the images. We're going to need to create new images, boat.png and cat.png. B is for, and C is for title, or I guess it's name. And page ID needs to be unique, 3 and 4. This is our data, 4 records. Now, we created a static file handling section of the code inside our request handler. We need another section for API routing. This part of the code will return the data in 2 different ways. So we need to process the URL. So we split it up. The URL parts is an array of all the different tokens in that URL that was requested. So if URL part 1 is API and request method equals get, then we are going to perform an API call which will return data, not a file, but some data from above. And we're going to do 2 different functions. We'll have an API function for table of contents that will give us the information we need to build our navigation on the left. And then we'll do another API call that will return a single row given the page ID. But let's start with table of contents. Table of content list, or TOC list, equals. Now, we don't want to return all of the data. All we need for a table of contents or navigation is going to be an identifier like page ID, so we'll take that, and the name. We don't need the image, we don't need the page text. That's for the other API call. So what we want is a list of page IDs and names. So I'm going to use the map function that will take our data defined above and map it to a new object called TOC list, and it will be a list of 4 records, but it will only have 2 elements in the list, page ID and name. So that's what I've done with that map statement. I'm taking just the page ID and name from the original data and creating a new set of data that is only a list of page IDs and names. We'll give the result a 200. Content type will be JSON. Return res end JSON stringify talk list. Okay, that is the table of contents API call. The other case is if URL parts 2 equal page data, we do something different. We're going to grab the record ID from the URL parts 3, and I'm going to subtract 1 because we're going to use that as an index into the array above. So if they pass in 1, indicating I want the first record, it's actually going to be the 0th record. I want to make sure that the record ID is within range of the data we have, so it should be either 0, 1, 2, or 3. This will be a success at this point in the code. It's a 200. Content type is JSON. Return res end JSON stringify. And here we're going to grab one of the records, so data record ID. So we're going to return one whole record with this request. And if it doesn't qualify for any of the code above, then we have an error. Go with a 404, res end, file not found. Okay, we have 2 API calls we are now supporting in addition to delivering the static files. And it all depends on what kind of request is received by our server. So let's go back to our client application and add our cat and boat. And let's also deploy that to the server, as it is now part of our front end that the server will deliver down to the client. And let's test out our APIs. So we're just going to type the URL into the browser. So it's a table of contents. Actually, first it should be API, then table of contents. Hit return. File not found. That's not what I wanted. What went wrong? Unexpected token. We're missing a quote. All right, save that. Run the server because it quit. Try that one more time. Okay, there it is. That is the JSON data returned. And you can see a nicer view of it over on the right in the Developer Tools window, looking at the Network tab in the response. So it returned all of the JSON data that we wanted, at least what we need to build our navigation on the left side. So you see it's just page ID and name. All right, let's try the API for page data. Give it a index, give me page 1, and what happened? Record ID not defined. Yes, it is, but it's a capital D, needs to be a lowercase d. Let's try again. Start that server back up. Let's hit that page data, and here we've said give me record number 1, and it gave us record number 1, page ID, name, page image lock, page text. Let's try 2, and there it is. A is for apple, which is correct. Record 3 should be B is for boat. Yes. And again, we're looking at raw JSON data here, so it won't look like this when we show it in our final application. We're just testing, and there is no fifth record, and I get a file not found. All is working. All right, let's go back to the client. Now that we have our server serving up data, let's go to the left side nav. So what we want to do is, instead of hard coding these links, introduction and AS4 in this component, we want to get the data from our API. So we'll need to add a few more things from React. Use state, which is going to tell us it's going to keep track of our currently selected navigation item, and use effect. Now these are hooks in React. If you don't know what that is, again, read up on it. It's important to understand what those are for React. We'll have a section of code above the return statement that will fetch our data for us. So this is our state, const TOC entries, which is our variable name, and we need a setter function called set toc entries, and the default value will be null. We'll have a loading state, set loading, use state, default value will be true. Another state variable error, set error is the setter, default value is null. So those three variables will keep track of state. Toc entries will be the table of contents data. Loading is a loading state, error is an error state. Now here's our use effect. Again, here's an arrow function. The use effect function is taking this arrow function as its first argument. Const fetch TOC data equal async empty parameters, arrow function, another arrow function. Inside here will be a try block where we start by setting the loading state to true. Const response equal await fetch, and here is our API call to the server. Now you see some keywords, async, await. Again, should read up on these if you don't know what they are. It is an asynchronous call. The await keyword can only be used inside of an asynchronous block, and it will pause execution until the fetch responds with data. Next step is to check, is the response okay? In this case, is it not okay? If it's not okay, we're going to throw an error, and we'll have to handle that error. If all is well, const data equal await response.json. Now we have two await calls. Await fetch will complete when we get a first response from the server, but that doesn't necessarily mean we got all the data. So that's why we have another await command or await keyword for response.json. Once we have all the data, then we set toc entries to the value of the data returned. Now we have to catch that error if we throw it. Set error, which is the setter function for our error state variable. And finally, block, where we will set loading to false. We are no longer in a loading state. We either have the data or we don't. Either way, we are not loading anymore. Okay, parentheses look good. And now we call the function that we defined in the previous code block. Fetch toc data with no parameters, and then I'm going to add a square bracket, a pair of square brackets on the end. This indicates that this function, useEffect, should be run one time when the component loads. So we don't need to get the table of contents over and over. We only need to get it once. So let's build. And actually, we're going to need to make code changes here. So we're not going to be hard coding list items anymore. We are going into JavaScript land, as they say. You do that with these curly braces inside the JSX HTML elements. And in here, you can refer to the elements above, like talk entries. This is our data, and we are going to do a map. And for each item, we want to perform the code in this arrow function. So we'll cycle through the list of items provided, and we want to create a list item for each one. When you do this using a map function, you must have a unique key. So we'll take the item page ID, again using curly braces to insert JavaScript into the HTML. Class name will be nav item. Inside the list item, we have a, give it the dummy href pound. Class name, nav link. The title of this will be the variable item.name from our data record that we're processing. That's our link. And we no longer need these hard-coded list items because now we're going to generate the list based on the data we get from our API. Okay, now let's build. Oh boy, another problem. We've got, we need a comma. This is a second argument after the first argument, which was a function that we passed in. Let's build. Success. Now we deploy. The output of the build process is a bundle.js. We need to copy that over to our server. This is how we deploy. Copy files from our front-end development folder dist into our back-end folder static. If we go to our site, we get nothing. What happened? Map doesn't like the map function. Oh, we need to handle the loading UI. So if we're loading, we want to return this simple loading message. And if there's an error, we want to show a simple error message. So you'll see the loading initially until the data comes back, and then it gets re-rendered when the data is assigned. And it should, in that case, skip down to the main rendering in the return statement below. Unless there's an error, then you would see the error screen. All right, we build. We copy our output from the build in our client project into the static folder of our server project. Refresh, there it is, and we have A is for apple, B is for boat, C is for cat. This tells me that we now have this left-hand nav is populated by our table of contents API. Now back to the client. We still need to trigger the right side to load a different page every time something on the left side is clicked. So to do this, we're going to go to our parent component, nav and main pane, where we have the left side nav and a letter page as children. So the letter page needs to be able to accept a number as an input. So this will be a property in React. So it's going to do different things based on the number that's passed in. It will load different pages. So if I pass in a 1, it should load a page that is fed by record number 1 from our data. So in the nav and main pane, I hard-coded in a 1. This is just going to be a test. So we're going to add a use state and use effect here in the letter page component as well. We will be making an API call as well as keeping track of state and the data returned and the loading state, similar to what we did in the left side nav. So these are our state variables. We have a page, set page. That will be the data that gets returned for a single page, initialized to null. We have a loading and set loading, which is our setter function. Allows us to change the value of the loading variable. Use state, default to true, const error, just like before, a little bit of error handling, default to null. Now, use effect. Again, is a function, takes a function as an argument. We will be setting that function as an anonymous arrow function and defining the code here. Const fetch page equal async empty parameter list to an arrow function, and we'll do another try block very similar to the other data fetch done in the table of contents code. Set loading to true. This will show a loading message until the data is returned. Const response equal await fetch API page data, and we're going to use the property page ID which means we have to use backticks since we're referencing a variable inside this string. If the response is not okay, throw error. This should look familiar. Page not found. Otherwise, const data equal await response dot JSON. Set page data. So setting the page to the value data should trigger a rendering, and then we need to catch our error. Set error. Yes, we have to include that error dot message. And finally, we are no longer loading. Set loading false. Okay, now we need to add a second parameter after the function. Previously we need to call the function now that it's defined. Okay, this is the second parameter after the function. Before we had an empty square bracket which indicated that useEffect should run once upon page load. This indicates that this function, useEffect, should run every time page ID changes. So this will trigger the page to change from apple to boat to cat every time that page ID changes. And this is what we forgot last time. Let's handle the loading case and the error case, returning the proper HTML. And if those two checks pass, we would fall through to the return statement below and render the page. Okay, let's try it. Build. It worked. We need to copy the bundle.js file that we just created over to the server. This is our deployment. Update that. I'll stop the server and start it. I don't think I need to, but just for good measure. Refresh. Okay. It's loaded a page, and if you recall, we passed in a value of 1 by default, and it should be showing introduction. But we can see that the API was called and it did retrieve this data record. Oh, yes. We still have all the content hard-coded to show Apple. We need to show whatever the page ID data is. So here's our page name, again using curly braces to insert the JavaScript where we want to use it. This is page.pageImageLock, short for location, and we have a page.pageText. All right, we need to build. That worked. Copy the output of the build process from the client project to the server static folder. All right, we refresh browser. There, it loaded introduction by default, which is record 1. That's what it should do. What we don't have yet is functioning navigation, so that when you click on one of the navigation items, it should trigger the page to load a different page. So we need an on-click. Actually, let's change this first. We need a state variable. Const. Yes, and we need to import the useState function from React. Const active tab, set active tab, equal useState default value of 1 for the intro page. So the left side nav is going to have an understanding and awareness of what the active tab is. So we will pass that in as a property. And we also need to pass in the setter function So this will allow the left side nav to update the active tab. And the left side nav and the letter page will, I would say, they kind of communicate through the parent nav and main pane. So that state of the active tab will be managed by this parent component, and it will be triggered by the left-hand nav, which will update the letter page being displayed. So we need to receive these two properties, active tab ID and update active tab. This is the value of the active tab and the function you can call to update active tab, both being passed in from the parent component nav and main pane. Okay, now in our anchor tag, which is the A tag, we need an onClick function that will set the value of active tab. This will be an anonymous arrow function, active tab. This is the update active tab to this item page ID. Now we need to update the class name. This is going to be dynamic now, because when I click on a nav item, I want it to indicate visually that it is the currently selected item. So it'll still be a nav link, but we'll have a condition that if this item is the active tab ID, then the class name is, it's the active style. And let me figure out where that's going to go in here. It needs to go after the question mark. Active. Or nothing. So it's always a nav link, but it might also be active or not. Okay, let's build. We've got a problem. Looks like we need a comma, right? Okay. Grab the bundle after the successful build. Deploy it to the server. Refresh our browser. Okay, introduction is active. There's A for apple, B is for boat, C is for cat. Fantastic. It works. And you can see every time I click, an API call is made with a different page ID, triggering the left or the right side to load the correct page. There's that loading message. Did you see that? There it is again. So the loading message displays until the data is returned and we can render the page properly. Fantastic. All right, the next step will be to set up our database, which is probably a lot easier than you think if you haven't done this. So we'll launch pgadmin. Now I know this, I said this was a simple application, and we've already done a lot, but hang with me, we are in the home stretch. We're going to set up the database, add a few records. We need to modify the server code so that the APIs make database queries instead of using that hard-coded JSON data. All right, so here is the database system. we need to enter our password. Okay, now we need to create a new database just for our application. So right click on databases, create, name the database the ABCs-database, comment is optional, and save. Now, over on the left side, right click our database, go to Query Tool, and here we will type an SQL command to create our table. Create table, pages. Inside these parentheses, we will define the columns, page ID. This is our primary key, serial primary key, name varchar 50. This is like a 50 character max text field. Page image location. This could get long, so I'm going to set it as a text. And page text, again, could be long. And that is our table. And execute by hitting the play button. And looks like that was successful. Okay, let's clear that out. And we should have an empty table. Select star from pages. Execute. And there's our empty table. Now we can start adding records manually right here in this view. There's different ways to do this. I'm doing it this way. So our name is introduction. Our image is images.logo.png. And our text is, this is the introduction. Okay, that's one record. Let's do a few more. A is for, and this is our apple.png. And A is for apple. B is for, it's a real cliffhanger. This is our images boat PNG. B is for boat. And don't forget C. C is for images cat PNG. C is for cat. And we need to save these or commit. Once we verify they look okay. Right, looks good to me. Save changes. All right, our database and table exist. There is a database server running. That information we can find here. So there is a database server running on localhost at port 5432. Username is Postgres. And our database is the ABCs-database, if I'm not mistaken. So let's go back to the server. We needed to set up a few things here. So this is a .env file. This is where you store special values. In this case, we're going to store our database connection string here. And oftentimes you've got things in this file like passwords, and they may be different based on if you're in a local development setting or a production setting. Your connection strings and passwords will be different. And the fact that you've got passwords in here, you usually want to kind of keep these files separate and safe and secure. You can see I've used the password secret password 01. That is a terrible password. Just for this demo, that's what I'm using. You should use something much more secure in a production environment. And so this is our connection string: Postgres, secret password, localhost, port number 5432. That should do it. And the name of this parameter or value environment variable is database underscore URL. And just added on the database name to the end of our connection string. That is important. There we go. All right, I'm going to create a new file called db.js. Doesn't do a lot, but it handles the database connection pool. So every time a request comes in, it's going to do a connection. So we're going to handle that in a separate file. We're going to import pkg from pg and import .env/config. Const pool equal pkg. Const pool equal new pool. And inside there, we are defining connection string as process.env.database URL. So that will pull the value from the .env file we just created. That's our connection string. We need to export default pool. Okay. So we've imported pkg and .env config in our db.js file. So we need to install those. And we haven't installed any packages in this server project yet. But we need them. So let's install. And you can see now we have a package.json file, package lock.json file, and a node modules folder, which is where all of these packages were installed. So in this case, yes, we need all these packages to do the database stuff. One thing we need to add here is now that we are using a package.json file, there's a few things we're going to add in here. I don't think all of them are necessary, but just by convention, I'm going to put in the name, call it the ABC server, and version number, and I think type is the important one. Type module. This has to do with how the execution handles the connecting all of the imports and things together. And now that we have external installed packages, we need to handle that. Okay. Now on the server code, we're going to import our pool from the db.js file we created. And we can comment out our hard-coded temporary data. We don't need that anymore. And we need to make a few code changes here to get our data from the database instead of that hard-coded list above. So we're going to comment that out. I'm going to create a new variable, a const actually, talk data equals await pool dot query, and here we will put a select statement in, and I only want the page ID and the name. And name is a keyword in SQL, in SQL, so I need to put that in quotes. I think I'm going to do that just for safeness. From pages, yeah, just from pages. But I do want to order by page ID ascending. All right, that is our select statement. It's going to return all of the records, but only the page ID and name columns. Talk list equal talk data dot rows dot map. And I need to do this mapping because I noticed that the column names in SQL or in our database were all lowercase. And this whole time we've been developing with a more of a camel case. So page ID needs to be mapped to page ID with the right case. So we have to handle that. Name doesn't really matter, it's the same. So we need to handle that difference in column names versus our data record names in the code. And since we called it talk list, we should be good there. All right, moving on to the page data. So this is the part where we request an individual page. We no longer need this -1 because the way we're going to do this query, we don't have to account for a 0 index. Const page equal await pool query select star from pages. So we want all of the columns from this table where page ID equals record ID. And we're going to use backticks. I'm going to change these quotes to backticks. Now, you really shouldn't build query strings this way in a production system. You open yourself up to SQL injection. There's a better way to do this, but for simplicity, we're doing it this way. So it should return a single record if the database has a record with that record ID. Now, I have to handle these differences in the case from the column names versus our variable names. So I'm going to do that here. So we're going to define a new JSON object, and we're going to populate it with the values in this page record. So page ID equals page ID, name is page.rows 0.name, page image lock is page image lock, and page text is page text. Now, in that code, I made a poor assumption that there will always be one record. I'm going to check that right now. So if page rows.length equals 1, meaning I have exactly one record from the database, then I will perform this block of code. right? So if it's 0 records or more than 1, that will be a problem, in which case we would return the error 404 below. This, we don't need that anymore, or that. We're going to back that up to align the code. And we're going to use the page data instead of this record ID index into our data. That was our hard-coded data above. Page data, that should work. All right, save it. Run the server. It's running. That's a good sign. Let's refresh the browser, and that's not quite right. So what went wrong? Okay. I see. This isn't going to work. That's not right. Const toc list equal toc data rows.map. Okay, we need to map, but it's got to be done differently. So I like to set up all my parentheses ahead of time. This avoids missing parentheses. Okay, so we will be mapping page ID and name from the database to page capital ID and assigning it this way. Let's try that. Server's running. Refresh the code. There we go. Navigation is working. Pages are loading. We are doing API calls, and each API call is making a database query. Fantastic. We have a full stack application. So let's add a little more to the database. So now the application is basically done. At this point, it's data entry, and of course I'm going to have to create some more images. But let's just add some more records, have a little fun. D is for donut. E is for, what could it be? Elephant, of course. E is for elephant. G is for grapes. Save that changes in the database. And we'll go back to our images folder. We need to add our new images to the server. and also to the client. And here we go. So this is our new database records with our new images all the way up to G, all being fetched from the database in our full stack React web app. We're done. Congratulations, we did it.